At some point, have you ever wondered what it would be like to live without social media? Not as an escape, but as a choice. Because quietly, more and more people are doing exactly that. They don't announce it, they don't explain it, they don't turn it into a manifesto. They simply keep living without the need to show it. And what's interesting is that this decision rarely comes from impulsiveness. It usually comes after noticing something specific about attention, time, and identity. Something that only becomes clear after spending too much time being watched, compared, and constantly updated. These people still connect, create, feel, and make decisions. They just do it outside the fast paced rhythm of constant exposure. And that changes more than it seems. It changes how time is experienced and how choices are made. This video isn't about quitting technology or romanticizing isolation. It's about understanding what leads someone to step away, what happens afterward, and why this choice says so much about the emotional world we're living in today. If you've ever felt tired without knowing exactly why, or curious about what it would be like to exist without always being available, this video might answer questions you haven't fully put into words yet. If this kind of reflection interests you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps keep this space alive and allows us to explore topics that rarely get real attention. Now let's continue. Choosing not to use social media is rarely a sudden decision. It usually doesn't come from anger or rejection of the modern world. Most of the time, it begins as a discomfort that's hard to name, a persistent sense that something about how attention is being used no longer makes sense. These people don't wake up one day wanting to disappear. They simply start to notice that they're always too available for opinions, comparisons, reactions, expectations, as if their presence has to be constantly accessible even when there's nothing to give. Over time, that becomes exhausting. Not exhaustion from information itself, but from the kind of attention that's required. Fragmented attention that never goes deep, that jumps from stimulus to stimulus, that turns even intimate moments into something potentially observable. And slowly, a question begins to form. When was the last time I experienced something without thinking about how it would look? That's when something shifts internally. People begin to realize that many of their decisions are no longer guided only by what feels meaningful, but by what's visible, what fits better, what creates less friction. And this realization is often uncomfortable because it exposes how much one's identity has been shaped by external reference points. Leaving social media at that point isn't a dramatic gesture. It's an adjustment, an attempt to recover a more continuous sense of presence, a way of existing that doesn't depend on constant updates, where time starts to feel different again. Without the permanent stream of comparison, certain things become clearer. Silence stops feeling like something that needs to be filled immediately. Loneliness loses some of its symbolic weight, and questions that were previously muted by constant stimulation begin to surface more clearly. That doesn't mean life suddenly becomes easier. Quite the opposite. Stepping away removes distractions, but it also removes buffers. Emotions that were once diluted by watching others now have to be felt more directly. Decisions carry more responsibility. Free time is no longer automatically occupied, and that's exactly why this choice isn't easy for everyone. Leaving social media means learning to live with a specific kind of absence, the absence of immediate validation. There are no instant reactions, no quick feedback, no constant confirmation that what you're living matters to anyone beyond yourself. But for some people, that absence starts to feel less threatening than the quiet dependence that existed before. They begin to notice that living without a constant mirror changes their relationship with self-worth. What matters starts to be decided from the inside out. Not perfectly, not permanently, but with more autonomy. And that shift changes the rhythm of daily life in ways that are hard to perceive while still immersed in the feed. In that sense, not using social media isn't about rejecting connection. It's about seeking a different kind of connection. One that doesn't require constant performance. One that doesn't turn every moment into a potential comparison. One that allows you to exist without being continuously interpreted. This choice reveals something important about the moment we're living in. It points to a collective fatigue with permanent exposure, a growing need to reclaim attention, depth, and presence. And most of all, it shows that some people are beginning to question not just how they connect, but why they've been connecting the way they always have. That's where the conversation starts to deepen. After someone leaves social media, the first thing that changes isn't their external life. It's their internal perception. The world keeps moving at the same pace, but the way they move through it begins to shift. Small details start to stand out. Time feels less fragmented. Pauses grow longer, and at first that can be uncomfortable. There's a specific moment in this process when something curious becomes clear. Many of the urgencies that once felt natural weren't actually urgent at all. They were conditioned responses, mental habits built through repetition. Without constant stimulation, certain reactions simply stop showing up. That doesn't mean instant calm, quite the opposite. For many people, the first days or weeks off social media bring restlessness, a feeling of being out of sync, as if something is missing, without knowing exactly what. That feeling is revealing, because it points to how much attention had been trained to seek external stimulation all the time. Over time, something begins to reorganize. Comparison loses intensity. It doesn't disappear completely, but it stops being automatic. People start to notice how many of their past decisions were influenced by invisible references, by what they were seeing, by what seemed desirable in the moment. Without that constant stream, choices slow down and, interestingly, become more conscious. Another quiet shift appears in how relationships are experienced. Conversations lose the pressure of being shareable. Experiences exist only for the people who are actually there. That changes the weight of interactions. They become less performative and more grounded, less concerned with documentation, more with presence. This is often when people realize something important. Leaving social media didn't pull them away from the world. It changed the kind of world they're engaging with. A quieter world, but also a less numbed one. Emotions become clearer. Good moments are lived without the rush for validation. Difficult moments aren't immediately diluted by distraction. This process takes adjustment. Not everyone feels comfortable with that level of direct contact with themselves. Being off social media removes a major filter, the filter of constant observation, and without it, people have to deal more directly with what they feel, think, and want. There's also a shift in how identity is experienced. When no one is watching, who you are doesn't need constant updates. It doesn't have to stay consistent with past versions. It doesn't need to be explained. This creates a rare space for internal experimentation, a space where you can change your mind without announcing it, grow without documentation, and move through phases without labels. But that space also brings questions that used to stay in the background. What actually matters when no one is watching? What still feels meaningful without immediate feedback? What kind of life continues to exist without witnesses? These questions don't arrive dramatically. They surface quietly in everyday moments, in simple decisions, in choices that used to be automatic and now ask for reflection. And this is often when people understand why they couldn't go back to social media after leaving. Not because they're better or more enlightened, but because something changed in how they relate to attention, time, and self-worth. Going back would mean returning to a rhythm that no longer fits in the same way. This movement isn't final or universal. Some people leave and return. Others reduce their use. Others simply change their relationship to it. The point isn't the choice itself, but what it reveals about how we're learning to live under constant observation, and what happens when that observation is no longer at the center of the experience. That's where the reflection begins to gain deeper layers. At a deeper level, what begins to reveal itself isn't just a change in behavior. Being off social media alters something more fundamental, the relationship with oneself. While someone is immersed in that virtual environment, much of their experience is mediated by the awareness of being seen, even when no one is actively watching. That constant sense of being observed creates a quiet effect. Over time, people learn to watch themselves before they act, to think about how something will be interpreted by others, to adjust feelings, opinions, and even desires to a diffuse expectation, not because anyone explicitly demands it, but because the environment itself trains this kind of self-regulation. When the social media environment disappears, that mechanism doesn't vanish immediately. It keeps operating for a while, almost like a reflex. People catch themselves thinking about sharing something that will never be shared, explaining a decision to an audience that isn't there, internally justifying choices that in practice no longer require justification. It's in this in-between space that something important starts to surface. Without the constant external gaze, an uncomfortable question emerges. Who decides what matters now? For a long time, that answer came from the outside, from what generated reactions, what was validated, what appeared relevant within the collective flow. Outside of that system, the hierarchy shifts, and that shift isn't comfortable. Some people describe this phase as strange, not in a negative sense, but in the sense of unfamiliar, as if they were relearning how to inhabit their own time. The day is no longer divided into shareable moments and discardable ones. Everything exists on the same level, and that demands a new kind of attention. This is the layer that's rarely mentioned. Leaving social media exposes how contemporary identity has been trained to function under a light but constant form of surveillance. Not oppressive surveillance, but seductive, a continuous invitation to be legible, interesting, and up to date. When that invitation disappears, something is lost, and something is gained. What's lost is immediate reference, the quick mirror, the feeling of being aligned with a collective rhythm. For some people, this creates anxiety, for others, relief. But for almost everyone, it creates silence, a silence that isn't emptiness, but the absence of external direction. And this is where the issue stops being about social media and becomes about psychological autonomy. Not autonomy in the sense of total independence, but the ability to sustain choices without an audience, to move through moments without translating them, to allow certain experiences to exist only for the person living them. This kind of autonomy isn't taught. On the contrary, we live in a context that rewards visibility, fast responses, and constant alignment. In that landscape, leaving social media isn't just a habit change, it's an interruption of ongoing training. That's why not everyone feels better right away. Some people miss the invisible structure that used to organize their days, the flow that filled the gaps, the feedback that gave shape to identity. Without it, internal reference points have to be built more carefully, but it's precisely in this process that something reorganizes. People begin to notice that many opinions they once defended weren't as solid as they seemed, that certain desires were more inherited than chosen, that some anxieties were amplified by constant comparison. Outside that field, these things don't disappear, but they lose intensity. Another deep shift appears in the relationship with time. Time stops being experienced as a sequence of stimuli and starts being felt as duration. Things take longer to unfold, and that stops being a problem. Urgency softens. Not because life slows down, but because it's no longer measured by immediate response. This change is subtle, but transformative. It affects how decisions are made, how relationships are sustained, and how personal value is felt. People begin to trust their own rhythm more, even when it isn't externally validated. And perhaps this is the deepest layer of all. Leaving social media exposes how our sense of personal value has gradually been outsourced. When that system stops operating, value has to be felt differently. Not as absolute certainty, but as something less dependent on constant confirmation. Not everyone who leaves social media recognizes this consciously, but almost everyone feels some shift along this internal axis. Something moves, something becomes quieter, something depends less on the gaze of others. At that point, the choice stops being merely practical and becomes existential. Not because the person is searching for something grand, but because for the first time in a long while, they're living without automatic translation. And that changes far more than it seems. After this internal reorganization begins, something curious happens. The person starts to be perceived differently, not because they've changed in any dramatic way, but because they've stepped out of certain invisible rituals that structure contemporary social life. Being off social media changes how others access you. There are no frequent updates, no constant signals about mood, opinions, or recent events. This creates a kind of opacity. And in a world accustomed to permanent transparency, that opacity stands out. Some people interpret it as distance, others as mystery, others simply struggle to locate who you are now, because without the continuous stream of exposure, identity is no longer tracked in real time. It has to be rediscovered through direct contact, in conversation, in shared moments, in presence. This shift affects relationships as well. Connections that relied heavily on constant updates tend to weaken, not because of conflict, but because of a lack of stimulation. Meanwhile, relationships grounded in real presence often gain more depth. Conversations become less reactive and more grounded. Contact stops being constant and becomes more intentional. For those who leave social media, this can feel ambiguous. On one hand, there's relief, less noise, fewer unspoken expectations, less pressure to keep up. On the other hand, there's a subtle sense of disorientation, as if you're living at a slightly different rhythm than the world around you. Not better, not worse, just different. At this point, many people realize something important. Not using social media hasn't made them invisible. It has made them less accessible. And constant accessibility is not the same as closeness. In fact, it often gets in the way of more genuine connection. Without permanent mediation, you have to tolerate absence. You have to accept that not everyone will know what's going on, that some stories won't be followed, that certain moments will exist without external witnesses, and that requires greater trust in your own experience. This adjustment doesn't happen overnight. At times, there's a temptation to return, not necessarily out of missing social media itself, but because of the ease it provides, the ease of being seen, remembered, and feeling part of something larger. Being off it means accepting that this feeling won't always be available. Over time, though, something settles. You begin to realize that being less exposed doesn't mean being less connected. It means choosing more carefully where emotional energy goes, with whom you share, and at what pace. This process also reshapes your relationship with other people's opinions. Not because they stop mattering entirely, but because they stop being omnipresent. Without constant feedback, you begin to trust your own judgment more, not as absolute truth, but as your primary reference. This brings a different kind of freedom, less euphoric, more quiet, less about endless choice, more about the ability to live without explaining everything, to change your mind without announcing it, to move through phases without naming them publicly. At the same time, this freedom demands maturity. Without the external mirror, there are no shortcuts to understanding what you feel. Emotions aren't immediately compared or normalized, they have to be lived through, and that can be uncomfortable. But it's precisely in that discomfort that something grows stronger. The ability to hold your own experience without immediately translating it. The ability to be present without turning everything into content. The ability to exist without an audience. This isn't a choice that needs to make sense for everyone. And it doesn't have to. The point isn't abandoning social media, but understanding what happens when someone steps out of this circuit of constant observation. What's lost? What's gained? And above all, what it reveals about how we've learned to live under a continuous gaze. It's in this space, Busa, between relief and unfamiliarity, that the experience begins to take on its deeper meaning. In the end, understanding the psychology of people who choose not to use social media isn't about defending a position or suggesting a single path. It's about recognizing that this choice reveals something important about the moment we're living in, and about how the relationship between attention, identity, and personal value has been shaped over time. These people aren't trying to escape the world, they remain present, engaged, interested. What changes is how that presence happens. It's less mediated by immediate reaction, less driven by constant comparison, more grounded in direct experience. Leaving social media doesn't resolve internal conflicts or eliminate insecurity, but it does change the environment where those insecurities are constantly stimulated. And that alone alters how they're experienced. Some lose intensity, others become clearer. All of them require more internal contact. Perhaps the most transformative aspect of this choice is the relationship with one's own pace. Outside social media, life stops being lived in short cycles of stimulus and response. Time stretches, things take longer to form, decisions mature without external pressure. That isn't always comfortable, but it's more consistent. That consistency shows up in how a person positions themselves in the world, not because they have better answers, but because they rely less on confirmation. The value of what they live no longer needs to be measured immediately. It can exist before being recognized. This way of relating to one's own life isn't taught. Quite the opposite. We live in a context that equates relevance with visibility and presence with exposure. Stepping away from social media interrupts that automatic association and creates space for other forms of belonging. Belonging in this sense stops meaning being seen all the time and starts meaning being in relationship more deliberately. Less expansive perhaps, but deeper, less immediate, but more stable. This doesn't make people who leave social media more aware, more evolved, or more balanced. It simply makes them people who chose to experiment with a different way of existing in the same world, one where not everything needs to be shared, explained, or validated in real time. Maybe that's the core insight of this topic. Not using social media isn't an act of denial, but of reorganization, an attempt to reclaim attention, presence, and discernment in an environment that constantly demands dispersion. From the outside, this can look like absence. From the inside, it often feels like the opposite, a different way of being whole. This reflection isn't asking anyone to do the same. It's simply an invitation to notice how our digital choices are connected to deeper emotional needs, and how small changes in that environment can reshape the way we relate to time, to others, and to ourselves. If this topic resonated with you in any way, leave a comment. Not to defend a position, but to share what this conversation stirred. Sometimes recognizing a question is already an important step. See you soon.